Good day everyone. So for today's video, I'm going to discuss to you all about inflation, always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. As we all know, inflation is a quantitative measure of the rate at which the average price level of a basket of selected goods and services in an economy increases over some period of time. Milton Friedman is famous for his adage that in the long run, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in the sense that it produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. Here, we will see that this adage is supported by our aggregate demand and supply analysis because it shows that monetary policymakers can target any inflation rate in the long run by shifting the aggregate demand curve with the autonomous monetary policy. To illustrate, look at figure 8 where the economy is at point 1 with aggregate output at potential output YP and inflation at the initial target of point 1. Suppose the central bank believes this inflation target is too low and chooses to raise it to point 3, then it eases monetary policy autonomously by lowering the real interest rate at any given inflation rate, thereby increasing investment, spending, and aggregate demand. In Figure 8, the aggregate demand curve shifts to AD3 because aggregate output is above potential output Y27YP. The short-run aggregate supply curve would shift up and to the left, eventually stopping at AS3, with the economy moving to point 3, where inflation is at the higher target level of point 0.3 and the output gap is back to 0. Okay, to raise the inflation target to point 0.3, the central bank undertakes an autonomous monetary policy easing of lowering the real interest rate at any given inflation rate, thereby shifting the aggregate demand curve rightward to AD3. The economy would then move to point 2 and the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift up and to the left, eventually stopping at AS3, moving the economy to point 3 with the output gap at 0 and the inflation at point. The analysis of that figure shown earlier was to demonstrate the following key points. First is the monetary authorities can target any inflation rate in the long run with autonomous monetary policy adjustments. And second is potential output and therefore the quantity of aggregate output produced in the long run is independent of monetary policy. Causes of inflationary monetary policy. Two types of inflation can result from an activist stabilization policy to promote high employment. First is cost push inflation results either from a temporary negative supply shock or a push by workers for wage hikes beyond what productivity gains can justify. And second is demand pull inflation results from policymakers pursuing policies that increases aggregate demand. So let's go first with the cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is a type of inflation caused by a substantial increases in the cost of important goods or services where no suitable alternative is available. Higher prices are then result as cost of production increases due to decreased aggregate supply. Cost push inflation is when supply cost increases or the amount decreases and then inflation occurs if demand rates remains at the same. An example of this is in 1970s oil market where the price of oil is controlled by an intergovernmental body known as OPEC or Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In the 70s, OPEC imposed higher prices in the oil market. However, ang demand dia had not increased. So that's an example of a cost push inflation, where when supply cost increases or the amount decreases and then inflation occurs if demand remains the same. And the second types of inflation that can result from an activist stabilization policy to promote high employment is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is asserted to arise when aggregate demand in the economy outspaces aggregate supply. It involves inflation rising as a real gross domestic product rises and unemployment falls as the economy moves along the Phillips curves. This is commonly described as too much money chasing too few goods. It is when the demand for a good or services is greater than supply which allows producers to raise prices. Cost push versus demand pull inflation. A cost push inflation can be initiated by a demand pull inflation, blurring the distinction. When a demand pull inflation produces higher inflation rates, expected inflation will eventually rise and cause workers to demand higher wages, which cost push inflation so that their real wages do not fall. Finally, expansionary monetary and fiscal policies produce both kinds of inflation, so we cannot distinguish between them on this basis. So that would be all for my topic, and thank you.